from an ethical philosophy through a relationship with the land specific to the people. Next, I discuss indigeneity as a process applied to transboundary negotiations through co-management arrangements. And then finally, I discuss indigeneity as a foundational ethic for decolonization and reconciliation. So here we go. Decolonizing is an action-based process of breaking down colonial inequalities, of structured hierarchies. Collaborative applications of Indigenous knowledge and/or worldviews are a baseline for social, economic, and political realms. Indigeneity is an identity that is deep, philosophical, and ethical praxis that can be used not only for Indigenous peoples, but for everyone. I explain indigeneity by referring to the work of Silgokinagin Jeanette Armstrong, who is also my mentor, who refers to indigeneity as a social philosophy and is not about ethnicity or race. As a philosophy, indigeneity is an idea that Indigenous peoples and all other life forms are equal. And that can be illustrated in concentric nested circles. Maybe some of you are familiar with that, but you have the individual, the family, the community, the nation, and the natural world in separate circles, but they're all interconnected. And more important, they're all equal. So like no one's better than the other. So Armstrong further articulates indigeneity as a social paradigm or worldview of living in reciprocity with the life force or timik of nature. Absent is that hierarchy of social beings in relation to each other and the ecology. Alternatively, the land and ecology are integral with the essential relationship component. Good relationships are nurtured and maintained among all living and non-living entities encompassing diversity and gender. As a concept, indigeneity is a self-defined identity through lived experience. The ethics or principles of indigeneity can be articulated by the 4R words that change depending on who you talk to and the context, but really building mutually respectful relationships and renewing and reciprocating those relationships. So that's really a foundation that is central as a transformative, decolonizing practice in everyday life that everybody can use. Benno Glossier suggests identity is within all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in our own value systems that are awakened when Indigenous worldviews and values are articulated. That really gravitated towards me. I thought that was really, really something that he said there. Capra, if you're familiar with the work of Fridtjof Capra, which I will talk about in a minute, but he quotes, "The shift of paradigms requires an expansion not only of our perceptions and way of thinking, but also our values," end quote. The interconnection between human and the ecology that is indigeneity is expressed by Dennis Martinez as concentric ecology. And concentric ecology is that reciprocal relationship with the ecosystem and the natural world where all are equally important. So really reiterating the work of Armstrong and others. So switching to Fridtjof Capra's systems theory, and you'll see how that can complement Indigenous theory by integrating indigeneity as a practice as I go through my talk here. But systems theory is based on non-linear patterns of relationships. And this is a quote by Capra. "Because living systems are non-linear and rooted in patterns of relationships, understanding the principles of ecology requires a new way of seeing the world and of thinking." So thinking in terms of relationships, connectedness, and context that goes against the grain of traditional Western science and education. So Capra's idea of systems theory conceptualizes that nested relationships found in natural ecology that I was talking about. Oops. So I've listed some components of systems theory that I'm going to discuss on this slide, so just for your reference. Capra systems theory encompasses the working relationship among nested networks that are interrelated and interdependent systems that work together to find and maintain a balance. Each part of the network speaks to each other and contributes to the whole working of the entire system. Each part of the system is then interdependent on the other part for survival. You can think of this in terms of the process of photosynthesis of plants that depends on the sun, and the animals that depend on the plants for survival. See, all of these things are interdependent as a community. Living systems are networks within networks and all have different challenges and complexities. So it is important that systems are diverse in structure to be able to adapt to changing environments. And changes happen all the time, we know that. But it is the severe disturbances that are, concerning, especially when you're talking about climate change. For example, if there's a severe disturbance that eliminates a species of plant or an animal, it impacts all other networks of the ecosystem, and we know that. The system will adapt to disturbances to find a new balance. Remember that systems will always seek to maintain a balance, even if that disturbance is negative. So things like oil spills in the ocean will force the ecology and water to find a new balance, even though that balance may be negative, right? Where it's exceeded the natural cycle. So the greater the diversity of a system, the better the chance that the system can adapt to these changes. But of course, there's always limits and totally radically changing that system. All systems are open systems, meaning they function as cycles of relationships, those nested relationships that I've talked about. So here we can see how indigeneity can work with systems theory. Systems flow as energy, for example, the solar energy. Nature is inclusive of feedback loops, of forming and revitalizing the system through continuous communication and symbiotic relationships. There's a built-in flexibility to the system and how it can adapt and respond to change. And I find that really fascinating because there is a way of using indigeneity and Capra systems in things like resource management and development practices as a foundation for decision-making, looking at that whole systems approach, and also using a different decision-making approach, which I'll talk about in a second. Systems theory includes the development of systems and how they can change, grow, adapt, and co-evolve over time. If we implement indigeneity and look at that whole systems approach, we can mitigate things like climate change. Networks of systems work together to achieve a dynamic balance based on patterns of behavior. This is adaptation at work. So the natural and circular elements of Capra's ideas of systems theory are relatable to indigenous philosophy in the application of a whole systems approach. Systems theory breaks down that hierarchy and encompasses indigeneity and those kinship relationships with humans and all living and non-living entities. In this way, systems theory offers a process of applying indigeneity as a praxis for actionable change, like thinking outside of the colonial box. That's what I've always told my students. Think outside the box. How are we going to do things differently? So indigeneity as an ethic can be applied as a baseline. Indigenous kinship relationships form the basis of social, economic, and political realms within Indigenous communities. It applies to governance as well. Indigenous leaders are mentors and non-authoritative. The mentorship aspect, excuse me, breaks down that hierarchical structure. Indigenous leaders are chosen based on their skills and abilities. This could mean there's a different leader for each task at hand, for instance. And there's also that built-in flexibility to adapt to changing environments. So in general, Indigenous communities use a consensus-based decision-making process that is very different from Western practices. And the consensus-based decision-making process is inclusive of everyone involved and acknowledges everyone's perspective. That is the difference. So we see how Indigenous practice, and it's also, the process is different too, if you've ever gone through some training in that. So we see how Indigenous practices overlap with systems theory that can be applied to a paradigm shift in thinking and doing. So next I want to talk about indigeneity as a transformative process for transboundary negotiations. Indigeneity as a praxis can be used as a baseline for Indigenous and non-Indigenous engagement. Indigenous peoples have territories across borders that existed prior to contact. So the US-Canada border, that virtual border, that boundary, for example, divides Indigenous communities on either side. The Columbia River Treaty is one example of a transboundary agreement and illustrates the challenges of respecting Indigenous knowledge. It is my understanding that Indigenous peoples are at the table and in the discussions, but are not treated as equals in the conversations. They're just observers. And in the US, it's even worse. And that came from a personal conversation with someone who does some work in that area. There are some other examples of co-management negotiations that are limited in this way. Meetings are dominated by Western parties and agendas that are culturally inappropriate for Indigenous peoples. Transboundary negotiations between Indigenous communities and nations with government and stakeholders can benefit by integrating Indigenous philosophical ethical practices. Treaties made with Indigenous entities are often in the form of co-management discussions and include things like impact benefit agreements, IBAs, and/or memorandums of understandings, MOUs, all offering potential solutions. Co-management practices, like I said, have been primarily driven by government and stakeholders. The engagement process is therefore, mandated by Western processes without the inclusion of Indigenous practices. And Indigenous peoples are just expected to go along with that. According to Figret Burks, co-management is a quote, sharing of power and responsibility between the government and local resource users. It is an arrangement whereby such partnerships can come about, end quote. Co-management as equal partnerships counter colonial systems of privilege and decentralizes the decision-making process and facilitates greater cultural understanding. Burks offers some strategies for improving co-management, including bridging knowledge gaps, incorporating Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science. It's pretty accurate. Cooperation for building strategies and tactics, engaging in participatory research, collaborating and co-producing knowledge, distributing power fairly and equitably, initiating trust, accountability, and transparency across multi-level networks of governance, and initiating decisions from the community level, something that the previous speaker spoke about. Co-management can work if there is equity and trust in the partnership, but there are challenges contributed to differences in engagement protocols that need to be considered. Okay. Sorry, I can't read the chat when I'm when I'm talking. So impact benefit agreements or IBAs and memorandums of understanding, MOUs, are beneficial for outlining the premise of co-management engagement practices between Indigenous and non-Indigenous parties. Both IBAs and, I'll leave that here. And both IBAs and MOUs have been used for a while, and they often include Indigenous cultural protocols to guide discussions. Agreements should be signed earlier and prior to the commencement of negotiations to be effective. So this last slide, I want to briefly talk about decolonization and reconciliation. Decolonization includes changing Western Eurocentric ideology and focusing on inclusivity, especially Indigenous peoples' protocols. Indigeneity as a baseline for changing the ideology behind our practices and processes offer hope to mitigate things like climate change. Decolonizing our minds and systems approaches can lead to new relationships and potentially, that R word, reconciliation, whether you agree with that term or not. Utilizing indigeneity as a framework for Indigenous and non-Indigenous engagement is a praxis for reconciliation. So the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. The National Inquiry into the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provide a framework not only for reconciliation, but a baseline for collaborative partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous entities. All three documents support one another for self-determination of Indigenous peoples, including individual and collective rights. The Truth and Reconciliation calls to action 43, 44, and 45 specifically apply to the implementation of UNDRIP into federal, provincial, municipal, and territorial laws. The other component in Article 44 is the development of national action plans to ensure the implementation of UNDRIP into Canadian law. Now we see that UNDRIP has legal standing in Canada and BC through Bills C-15 and 41 respectively, with comprehensive action plans. UNDRIP provides hope as a framework for reconciliation and Indigenous self-determination, not only provincially, but nationally, but also I think it can be a foundation for global change. Implementing UNDRIP into Canadian and BC laws, is going to be onerous and time-consuming, and we're seeing that now. And whether you agree that anything is going to be done or not, it's there. But implementing UNDRIP globally as a framework can provide common ground for ethical engagement and perhaps, change the landscape. Indigenous peoples are everywhere. They're behind these grassroots movements. So I think that might be really, really an important foundation. So in summary, indigeneity can be a baseline for climate change if Indigenous ethics are a foundation for social, economic, and political systems. Using a whole systems approach in ideology and application can mitigate climate change anxiety. And I'll end it there. Sorry, I don't know what time we're at.